Space Biosciences specializes in harnessing language modeling, correlation, matrix data sets, and real-time updates to uncover hidden relationships within scientific data, particularly in the realm of space biosciences. Their technology enables the detection of implicit connections among various objects, like genes, proteins, and biochemicals. And with me is the CEO, Kasian Franks, to talk about this fascinating company. I feel like it's like kind of, new age, and what you're doing is so cutting edge. So let's talk about the company and how you've established this VSB Ventures, the Ventures unit. Provide us with the details on that and what's behind that strategy.
Sure. So first, I'd like to mention that language models are the tip of the spear in AI today. This is one of our taglines, because most people have heard of large language models, but they're also small language models and ensembles of those. And when it comes to establishing connections or relationships between genes, drugs, diseases, proteins, biochemicals, phytochemicals, micronutrients, it's really about the hidden relationships that can be extracted, because that's where a scientist or a research institution or even a semiconductor company might make a discovery. So it's all about making, both trivial and novel discoveries. They lead to new innovations. And when it comes to space, it's very important to understand that there's a new space race happening right now. And there are also data centers being established in space to support this new space race. That includes building lunar bases on the moon. It includes even going to Mars and Europa. Now, when you look at space, you can also understand that there are trillion-dollar asteroids out there. There are quintillion-dollar asteroids out there. In terms of
the metals and things that they have?
Yeah, the rare earths. From all kinds of rare earth metals. And on the moon, there's helium-3. NASA just discovered a 700 quintillion-dollar asteroid out there. And we'll be mining those, in the future.
That is mind-boggling.
Yeah, okay. And, even today, China, being on the far side of the moon, just completed the world's first sample return from the far side of the moon. And on the moon, you've got, like I mentioned, helium-3, you've got hydrogen, and all kinds of things that we need to explore space, but also to generate revenue.
Okay, absolutely.
By the way, one more thing.
Fascinating.
Space includes the largest TAM, total addressable market, that will probably ever exist in history, in the history of humanity.
All right. I definitely want to talk to you a little bit more about that, but let's bring it down to earth for a second. Do you have any more listings planned for any exchanges?
Well, what we're doing is we're following a proven, an industry standard, proven, let's say, strategy related to being an incubator, but also establishing a ventures unit. Many have heard of Google Ventures, for example. Many have heard of a company called IAC. That's another example of a successful incubator. So Google has over 200 companies that it's incubated. And this is, like I mentioned, a standard operating procedure for any company that wants to scale. And right now, when you look at what we do, we're a hybrid startup. That means we've got an equity arm and we've got a crypto arm. Now, when you look at your crypto arm and your equity arm, and you create spin-offs or joint ventures or subsidiaries, you usually want to package them inside of your ventures unit. So we have VSB Ventures, that's Space Biosciences Ventures. And that includes today about 5 companies. So we'll be spinning these off. We hold the majority interest in them. And most importantly, each one has a net asset value that gets calculated or moved back onto the books of our parent company.
Back onto the parent company. Yeah, makes sense. Now, when do you plan on launching your first biological satellite? And explain first what that is, and then what are the plans for that?
Sure. The reason it's important to distinguish between telecommunications satellites, small sats, or those kinds of CubeSats, and what we're doing on the biological front is that you have companies like Bristol Myers Squibb, as we've mentioned in the past. You've got companies like Eli Lilly and Merck that are already launching to the ISS to understand how proteins crystallize a bit better in microgravity. And they can take that template back down to the ground and make more effective drug compounds, for example. And that, connects to their bottom line. But what we're doing is we're enabling these companies to, like with AstraZeneca, for example, enabling these companies to place a biological payload or an experiment to the tune of between 250,000 to 5 million per launch, depending on how big the big the CubeSat is, and the, of course, cost and design of the experiment. And they have to do multiple launches. So that's the key. You can't just do one launch. So for us, we're already on the launch calendar with a company called NanoRacks out of Texas. We'll be launching from Vandenberg AFB Air Force Base / Space Force Base, which is what they call it today, or out of Houston or Cape Canaveral. So we're already on the launch calendar. We're looking at our launch window given to us by NanoRacks and a few other government organizations that put us in between November and February at this point.
Of 2024, 2025.
Yeah.
So this is all amazing, but it is very capital intensive and maybe some of it's kind of far out in the future. When do you expect to be profitable?
We expect to be profitable second quarter 2025.
Okay.
And that's because after our first inaugural launch, we plan on launching. Our goal is to launch between 2 and 3 per week. Right now, SpaceX launches about 2 per week, and that's just one launching company, by the way. There are hundreds of launching companies, and we'll be partnering with each one to scale up so that we can launch, as many as possible. And in terms of pricing and, cost associated, prices are dropping every day.
Of satellites and all the operations needed to launch.
Absolutely. Yeah, launches cost today between $50,000 and $80,000 per launch, whereas they used to cost, 10 times that much just a couple of years ago.
Interesting. So you talked a little bit about the total asset market value of space and what is in space. I mean, can you elaborate on that a little bit more, and the space ventures you're involved with, and how do you extract some of that value for use?
So let me show you our extraction device here. This is a CubeSat.
Okay.
And this CubeSat contains what's called the CERN TimePix-2. It's a radiation measurement detection system.
This is a satellite.
This is the satellite. Right here. As you can see, it has a logo right there on it.
Okay.
Pretty nice. We have a team in La Jolla, California. That's part of UCSD and Cal Poly. And with this CubeSat, you can see that there's a camera inside right there.
Okay, yep.
And then we've got solar panels on the outside. And then we've got measurement devices on the inside. And we have a Raspberry Pi chipset.
Okay.
And what that means, this is key to companies, our other customer bases, which include NVIDIA, which include any semiconductor company from Taiwan Semiconductor to AMD to ARM. All of these companies, interestingly, and in terms of profitability and related to the total addressable market, all of these companies need to establish data centers in space. Some of them are already doing it. Not NVIDIA, but there are other companies establishing data centers in space. Now, the reason you want to establish a data center in space is so that you don't have to transmit terabytes and petabytes of data and clog up satellite networks with just one data center. So as data centers support space operations, from establishing lunar bases to mining asteroids to doing whatever, these companies will need to have their chips space and radiation hardened. And you might ask, well, what does that mean and why? Well, one of the reasons is that you've heard of solar flares, maybe knocking out power plants, for example. Well, in space, you don't have the magnetosphere to protect against those SPEs, solar particle events, or galactic cosmic rays, which when they hit a chip, they can corrupt data on the chip. So what we'll be doing with a new venture of ours is enabling companies like NVIDIA, like AMD, or Intel even, or Broadcom, or any company that's involved with launching chipsets into space. Remember, we need our AI chips in space to, manage the data and extract new discoveries. But we'll be enabling these companies to understand where the weaknesses are in their chips as we measure from CERN's radiation detector the amount of radiation that it takes maybe to cause a problem within the chip. And that would be a stressor for hardware. A galactic cosmic ray hitting against that chip, and then, or the memory, and then corrupting data. So we can provide a report to companies like NVIDIA or companies like TSMC, or you name it, Qualcomm, Broadcom, to help them understand that if they want to build data centers in space, here's where they need to make their chips more robust based on our partnership with CERN, based on our partnership with Advocam, which actually provides the entire chipset to measure the radiation and so forth. And that's a very valuable service, because data centers are going to need to be established in space with AI chips.
Well, I mean, I've never thought about that, but that does kind of make sense, because we're going to have such demand for these data centers in the future. So
yeah. And they're being built right now
Yeah.
in space.
fascinating. Since the last time we talked, have there been competitors in this space?
Well, interestingly, most companies are focused on building communication satellites, for example, or satellites that take pictures of what's on the ground or in space or what have you. Satellites that use lasers, on the Iridium network to transmit data. Most companies don't have that deep knowledge domain expertise in biosciences mixed with space. And we've been working in space biosciences at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, for decades, literally. And we have a scientific advisory board, which helps us do what we need to do in terms of designing new experiments related to precision medicine, because our primary job is to understand how to create countermeasures against diseases that result from stressors during human spaceflight. The countermeasures might be a repurposed drug compound, so we don't have to go through 5 or 10 years of FDA approval. A countermeasure might be related to preventing a guy like Scott Kelly, who spent a year in space, from losing 30% of his heart muscle. So muscle atrophy is a big problem in space because of microgravity, which is a stressor. Radiation is also a stressor that we need to solve for. So, and that means that we are using our little friends here called water bears.
Yeah.
And this is an example of 50 water bears in here that we'll be launching into space.
I've seen those under a microscope.
Right.
Yeah.
You can't see them now. They're about 500 nanometers in length, and that means about 6 human hairs. So if you take the width of 6 human hairs, that's about how big they are. So we can't really see them. But we've got 50 astronauts in here that are very small and easy to transport.
And what do they do again?
So number one, they repair their DNA 2,000 times faster than humans. They're extremophiles. So the more we learn about how well they fix their DNA, repair their DNA, the more we can learn about how to do something extremely important for everybody on the ground. Because once again, as we mentioned before, this is not about it's not just about protecting astronauts and billionaires in space. It's about translating these countermeasures into new forms of precision medicine for all mankind.
For everybody, yeah. Do you have sponsors that will help you with the launches and things?
Yeah, that's a good question. Everybody wants to sponsor us, by the way, because they're pretty excited about what we're doing. From companies like NVIDIA to Oracle to Morningstar, in fact. So we've got a number of other semiconductor companies and even individuals. So eventually we'll be launching individuals' names and DNA into deep space.
Now, have any new portfolio companies been added to VSB Ventures since we last talked?
Yes, and we'll be announcing them in the future. Right now, we've got one that will be strictly focusing on protecting chips or semiconductors in space, as related to what I just mentioned.
Now, you mentioned NanoRacks, that you're working with them and that you have this launch. So tell me a little bit more about that and what are you launching exactly, and what kind of information can you glean from that?
Yeah, so our first launch is going to be testing this version of the Raspberry Pi chipset and detecting radiation. And we're also considering on our first launch to do a test launch with the tardigrades, the water bears here. But our second launch will include a more advanced launch and a larger CubeSat, and may also include an additional launch, which would be this is a 1U, by the way, something that's twice this big. They call it a 2U, 3 times 3U, right?
Makes sense.
So
even I can get that.
When you look at this, the more space you have, the better experiment you can design. And in particular, what we're going to be doing is working with companies like Oxford Nanopore and understanding how we can sequence the DNA of tardigrades for mutations and then compare them to a ground control.
Okay. How many launches do you expect to have per week when you're fully operational?
Yeah, I would say 2 to 3. But our goal, of course, is to maximize that, maybe even double that, depending on the launch providers, from the Mojave Air and Spaceport to Vandenberg, Houston, Cape Canaveral.
And then how much revenue will you get per launch, and who is paying for these launches? Pharmaceutical companies? Or?
Yeah, pharmaceutical companies and semiconductor companies.
Okay.
So, for example, NVIDIA, as mentioned, the other semis out there, most semis. But we're initially going to be focusing on the pharmaceutical companies, and the way we enter our market, our go-to market strategy would be to, contact all bioinformaticists and computational biologists. So for a company like Eli Lilly, they have thousands of bioinformatics people and scientists. And these are people that use a combination of hardware and software to analyze your multi-omics. Not only your genomics, your microbiomics, your epigenomics.
All of the omixes.
Yes, your transcriptomics, your inflammasome, and the list goes on.
Yeah. So how do you expect these venture companies to add value to the parent company?
So the venture company will be focusing on something very specific, either to biology or to hardware in space. And as you know, biology is very complex.
Mm-hmm.
So, anybody that says they're a doctor, you kind of have to ask them, are you a foot doctor or a brain surgeon? So there's a huge swath of individuals that work at pharmaceutical companies, biotechs, that have a very specialized area. That's one reason that you have thousands of biotechs and thousands of pharmas that usually just focus on one specific drug compound or maybe 2 or 3 diseases, for example.
Fascinating. So do you anticipate being revenue positive 2025?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Yeah. And then what about the SBIO token? What's the latest with that? Will it become a security token? Where can people find out more about it?
Yes, we've gotten a number of questions on that front. And right now we're navigating regulatory waters, uncertain regulatory waters. Mm-hmm. So it's very important for us. For example, we made the decision to launch SBIO and go straight away for a security token or being a registered security with the SEC. Mm-hmm. But when we made that decision to go in that direction, 2 or 3 months later, all of a sudden, the U.S., the SEC kicks out exchanges, like KuCoin, LBank, you name it. And so we had to, reconfigure our strategy, basically. And that just meant becoming a utility token first while maintaining in tandem or concurrently the path toward being a regulated security. And one of the reasons for that is because we understand, we've been regulated in the past, fully filing public company in the past. So we're used to dealing with the SEC and FINRA and things like that. But what we understand as well is that companies like Fidelity, large institutions, very large institutions, really won't be allowed to trade meme coins, scam coins, and the other kinds of coins that we know. And that means that you must be a security token. You must open up your books. You must allow the public and report for the public, above board numbers.
That's interesting. So it seems like that's where we're headed.
Yeah. There's no choice. Yeah.
Do your portfolio companies have a crypto arm as well as an equity arm?
Yes. We value both arms, crypto and equity. That's really the only way to do it. Even though there's not a single VC, not a single investment banker today that understands how to create a valuation model for a company that has a crypto arm and an equity arm. For example, if your crypto arm is trading at, a modest 100 million in market cap and your equity arm is only worth 2.5 million, how do you actually create a valuation for that company? Nobody really knows how.
Yeah.
Do you give a discount on the market cap of the crypto? If your investor audience is more interested in the crypto and not the equity, there's that, or they're more interested in the equity and not so much the crypto. And we've been dealing with all kinds.
Uncharted waters for sure. And a lot of this stuff.
Just the way we like it.
Well, Kasian, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. Can't wait for our next conversation.
Sure thing.
Thanks.
Waiting for it.
Okay.
Thanks.